Israeli Prime Minister Sharon and the impact it might have on Middle East peace. The Arab American Institute hosted this event. You'll hear from the president of the Institute, James Zogby, along with some Middle East analysts. It's about an hour and a half.
Good morning. My name is Maya Berry. I'm Director of Government Relations for the Arab American Institute. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Our intent this morning is basically during Prime Minister Sharon's visit to put him in some historical context that might be different than what you're getting from some traditional media outlets. We have with us this morning, three experts that are going to provide some very insightful commentary on both his trip and the Middle East peace process in general. First, we have Dr. Shibli Telhami. Dr. Telhami holds the Anwar Sadat Chair for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. In addition to his academic activities, Professor Telhami has been a frequent contributor to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times. While a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow, he served as advisor to the U.S. delegation to the United Nations during the Iraq-Kuwait crisis and was on the staff of Congressman Lee Hamilton. He was also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences study group that was instrumental in the informal negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians that led to the Declaration of Principles Agreement. After Dr. Telhami, we will have Rob Malley, who until January 2001, Mr. Malley was the Special Assistant to the President for Arab-Israeli Affairs and Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs at the National Security Council. In his capacity, he served as a principal advisor to the President and National Security Advisor at the White House on the Middle East peace process. Mr. Malley joined the NSC staff in August of 1994 as Director for Democracy. He helped coordinate U.S. refugee policy and efforts to promote democracy and human rights abroad. Mr. Malley is a graduate of Yale, Harvard Law School, and Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. Last, we have Dr. James Zogby. He's founder and president of the Arab American Institute, the political and policy research arm of the Arab American community. As co-founder and chairman of the Palestine Human Rights Campaign in the late 1970s, he later co-founded and served as the executive director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. In 1982, he co-founded Save Lebanon Incorporated, a private nonprofit humanitarian and non-sectarian relief organization which funds health care for Palestinians and Lebanese victims of war and other social welfare projects in Lebanon. In 1993, he was asked by Vice President Gore to lead Builders for Peace, a private sector committee to promote U.S. investment in the West Bank and Gaza. A lecturer and scholar on Middle East issues, Dr. Zogby appears frequently on television and radio. Our format this morning is very simple. We're going to hear from each of the speakers and then open up to a dialogue with questions and answers from our audience. Thank you again for joining us.
Shibli? Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to speak here today. What I'd like to do is just make a few points about my interpretation of the election of Mr. Sharon's and also where I see his strategy at the moment. First, I think it's very important to understand what his victory means. Mr. Sharon won by a huge landslide in Israel, unprecedented really in Israeli politics, and he has managed since to put together a national unity government, which has eluded many other prime ministers before him. So he has really succeeded in persuading the Israeli public to give him a chance to lead, despite the fact that he had a huge image problem, not only in the international community, but really within Israel itself. If you asked Israelis only a year ago whether they imagined that Mr. Sharon would be the Prime Minister of Israel, they would tell you probably not. And so it's very important to come to grips with what his victory means. And obviously there are two interpretations of what his victory means. One interpretation is that the Israeli public essentially rejected the compromises that Mr. Barak offered. And as a consequence, they were willing to support any alternative, in this case Mr. Sharon, to those compromises that the Israeli public would not accept. The second interpretation is that it was really mostly a rejection of Mr. Barak personally. And I think that, in my judgment, this is the case that I'm going to make, it was more of a rejection of Mr. Barak than a rejection of the compromises. This is not a mandate to pursue a different policy. This is a rejection of Barak the man in Israel. And I can give you a number of indicators to support this. First, when you look at the polls that were conducted throughout the Israeli campaign, the vast majority of the Israeli public continued to support the peace process, despite the fact that they were rejecting Mr. Barak personally. A second indicator is that when the polls when the pollsters asked how Mr. Peres would do against Mr. Sharon during the campaign, it was dead heat. Mr. Peres, who certainly is anything but a right-winger, and who was for compromises with the Palestinians, would have had a very good shot at winning. And the third indicator is what transpired in the election itself. A large segment of the public that rejected Mr. Barak was actually to the left of Mr. Barak on peace process. The most important segment of the public was the Arab citizens of Israel, 95% of whom had supported Mr. Barak in the previous election. And in this particular case, they abandoned him completely. In fact, only about 18% of them voted. And certainly they didn't abandon him because they thought he was more forthcoming in concessions to the Palestinians, because frankly they wanted him to make further concessions on this issue. So there were a lot of indicators that this was a rejection of the man, not a rejection of his policies. And frankly, even when you look at Mr. Sharon's margin of victory, which was large, you have to put it in the context of the fact that many Israelis did not vote. This was the lowest turnout in Israel's history. There were a lot of people who essentially decided not to come because they were not especially enthused about the choices. So I think it's a very big mistake to assume that this was a rejection of the peace process or even the rejection of compromise. In fact, I would dare say that had Mr. Barak succeeded in reaching a deal with the Palestinians back in July during the Camp David negotiations, I believe he would have gotten reelected. I believe he would have gotten it through the system. Ultimately, the problem for him was not that he was not trusted. He mishandled his domestic political base. He lost supporters right and left. But he also failed. And nothing fails like failure. I mean, essentially, people don't support failed leaders. He proceeded, he went to the brink, and ultimately an agreement did not materialize. And so he was rejected. Obviously, one other element in the Israeli mindset was the fears that Israelis had after the beginning of the Intifada in September. Clearly, the Israeli interpretation of what happened was very different from the Palestinian interpretation of what happened, and that generated a reaction and a set of fears in the Israeli public. So that certainly was a complicating factor, and Mr. Barak himself, to the extent that he appeared to be, quote, zigzagging, one day saying, I will not negotiate while it's going on. The next day he will change his mind. He kept doing that, and people did not have much faith in him personally. So in a way, I think it's much more a rejection of Mr. Barak than anything else. Nonetheless, Mr. Sharon is there. And it doesn't matter why the leaders get elected. Once they're there, they have a mandate, they're perceived to have a mandate, and he could proceed. So what are the options that are open to him, and how will he proceed, and what are the possibilities for an agreement in the short term? Well, first, I think that his most important mission in the early days, including during his visit in Washington at the moment, is to overcome his image. Clearly, he's trying to show himself to be a statesman, to make people disregard or discount his past. And he has done actually rather well in terms of the sort of statements that he has made since he was elected as Prime Minister in reassuring people that he's trying to behave as a statesman. He will do a lot more of that in the near future to establish himself as a responsible statesman. The second thing I think that he wants to do, he understands very well why Barak was defeated. And he thinks it is largely because he was not seen to be trustworthy, that he changed his mind over and over again. It became a metaphor in the Israeli media coverage. And I think as a consequence, he will be very careful in terms of what he's going to promise and what he's going to deliver. And I think that, therefore, at least in the early weeks and months of his administration, he's going to try to appear to be a man of his word, both to his own public and to the Palestinians. He doesn't want to send the wrong signals to the Palestinians. The Palestinians, by the way, had a similar interpretation of Barak, that he's not a man of his word. They basically had the same reaction as the Israeli public to Mr. Barak. And they want to be persuaded that the new Israeli leader is a man of his word. So he's going to try to do that, and that might ultimately be a problem, because if he promises too much, like, for example, no negotiations until all violence stops, I'm not sure that either he or the Palestinian Authority are capable of fully controlling the violence, perhaps minimizing it, perhaps slowing it, perhaps reducing it, but he may put himself in a box on this particular score, but that's going to be a test very early on. The third important mission for him, I believe, is going to be to persuade people, particularly in the U.S. and the West, but also the Palestinians, that a final status agreement is not possible in the short term, and therefore that the focus should be on an interim agreement. And in that regard, it would be a hard sell for the Palestinians, because I think the Palestinians have been very frustrated with interim agreements. They see, in fact, the failure of Oslo to be based on this step-by-step approach, which didn't deliver ultimately. Frankly, the Palestinians today, in terms of the situation on the ground, economically and otherwise, are worse off today than they were just before the Oslo Accords in this environment. So it's very hard to persuade them to buy into a process that does not have immediate payoff. And so it'll be very interesting to see how he would handle that. It would have to be quite a sell, and it would have to have some immediate change on the ground for it to be somewhat acceptable to the Palestinians. I also find it very difficult, actually, for the Palestinian Authority to engage publicly in a diplomatic effort aimed at an interim agreement. I don't think its public would allow it to do so. So, in fact, I think to the extent that there is a diplomatic possibility for any kind of an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians in the short term, it is going to be through secret diplomacy, not through public diplomacy. It would be through channels that probably are not going to be publicized, because I don't see that they are, either one of them is capable of setting out public conditions that would be acceptable to their own constituencies at the moment in embarking on the kind of negotiations that would have to take place in the short term. I think one last thing that Mr. Sharon is going to do is to try to gain the public opinion upper hand. Clearly, the Intifada can be perceived in different ways. Arabs and Palestinians, other people in the international community see it as an effort by people under occupation to relieve themselves of that occupation. The Israeli public perceives it as a coercive measure to try to get them to compromise. And they blame the Palestinian Authority for doing it. They do not see it as a natural outburst, spontaneous outrage of the Palestinian public. And I think there is a public opinion campaign going on, and clearly part of it is to put Arafat in a box in terms of pressure on this issue, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the battle ahead. Let me just say one final point about the role of the U.S. in this regard. I don't think, frankly, the U.S. can do a great deal in the short term, in part because you have to take a stock of where the parties are. I think today, when you look at the Palestinians and the Israelis, you're not sure where they're headed. Because, for example, the Palestinians may conclude that it is not possible to make a deal with Mr. Sharon. They may reach that conclusion. If they reach that conclusion, they may decide they don't want to hand him a political victory at home through some pacifying process so as not to reward him in the next time in the election. Which would mean that they would follow a different strategy. Or they may conclude that they can live with something less than a final status agreement, and therefore they're willing to negotiate with him, and that he would give them enough for that to be possible. Or they may even conclude that there is a chance, a miraculous chance, that he might in fact go for a final status agreement that's acceptable to them. And so it's hard to know what the Palestinian interpretation is, and I see the next 2-3 months as really testing the waters. And I think that's the same for Mr. Sharon, because Mr. Sharon today is, sure, it's a directly elected prime minister, but anyway, he's boxed himself as well politically in two ways. He boxed himself first in entering into a national unity government, and therefore he has to try to maintain that national unity government. The two most important foreign policy positions, that of the foreign minister and the defense minister, are in the hands of the Labour Party. And more importantly, he immediately agreed with the rest of the Knesset to change the electoral system once more from the direct election of the prime minister into a party system, which means that the next time he's going to be more dependent on his party than he's going to be dependent on the public, which means he's going to have to play party politics much more. He has less freedom, even though he can maneuver during his administration. If he's going to look forward to another election, he's going to have to think party system. So there's a lot of constraints around him politically to move. As for the U.S., I think that I cannot imagine the U.S. jumping in politically until the situation is interpreted to be ripe. By ripe, I mean until, number one, you know what the parties want to do, and number two, you feel the parties will accept a role for you to mediate. Certainly this could happen on a small scale, particularly if, in fact, through secret contacts they decide that there is room for them to negotiate. There need to be some public steps that would have to be negotiated, including the security environment on the ground, where the U.S. can play a very important role if the parties wanted to play that role. The second possibility is that if you have, in fact, an escalation in the violence, which is a possibility, maybe one can argue a likelihood instead of a negotiation in the short term, where you have very harsh Palestinian activities and very harsh Israeli measures. That is, that you have, for example, Hamas carrying out attacks inside Israel, Israel carrying out huge attacks in the Palestinian areas on a scale that we have not witnessed, which I think is possible and, as I said, maybe even likely. In that environment, it would be very consequential for the U.S., not just in that arena, but in terms of the connection between American interests on the Palestinian-Israeli front and American interest elsewhere in the Arab world. And therefore, I think the U.S. could not just sit on the sideline if this were to escalate, and before you know it, you would have some attempt by the United States to try to mediate. Am I pessimistic? Am I optimistic? Well, let me end by saying I am neither at the moment. I think this is, if I have to look on the basis of previous history, it's very hard to be optimistic if by optimistic one means that one would expect an agreement anytime soon, or even one would expect a reduction in violence anytime soon, or an improvement of the situation on the ground anytime soon. The past history is hard to overcome, and it's very hard to imagine, for example, that Mr. Sharon will accept anything close to what Mr. Barak offered. Miracles do happen, and I think that we have to remember that, in fact, many of the breakthroughs that have happened on the Palestinian-Israeli front, the Arab-Israeli front in general, happened by some unpredictable acts of leadership by one party or another. And of course this could happen, but I'm a political scientist and I stick with the numbers. It doesn't look too good. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you. I want to take a brief look back at what happened and see in what way it could inform what might happen, and where the United States may wish to go. Let me start by asking the question, if we were to write a history of the last 18 months, the months of the negotiations in which the Clinton administration was involved and I was involved, what would it be? Well, it would be at least two different stories, perhaps many more. On the Israeli side, it would be a story of giving, unmasking, and then unleashing. Giving, the notion that Barak made the most far-reaching proposals any prime minister of Israel has or could give to the Palestinians. Unmasking, the notion that by his refusal to accept these proposals, Arafat unmasked the true motivations and aspirations of the Palestinians, and that they were not inclined to compromise, and that they were not accepting of the partition plan, they were not accepting of peaceful coexistence with Israel. And then unleashing, and that's the unleashing of the violence which so many Israelis see as a premeditated move by the Palestinian leadership in response to what they saw as insufficient concessions by Israel and a pressuring tactic in order to get out of the corner in which, again, in Israeli eyes, many Israeli eyes, Arafat had been placed. From the Palestinian side, you'd get a very different story, and we got a very different story. It's a story of betrayal and a story of conspiracy. Betrayal of the promise of Oslo after 7 years, worse living conditions, more settlements, more harassment, no end in sight for the occupation, and certainly endless deferrals of commitments that had been made in countless agreements that had been negotiated and then renegotiated and then renegotiated again. And conspiracy between the United States and Israel, seen time and again, and in their eyes, most recently in the run-up to Camp David, at Camp David, and then after Camp David. And so from the Palestinian perspective comes this notion that Israel had never accepted the legitimacy of Palestinian desires and the need to redress a historic wrong. So I think what we're seeing here is an era in which both sides are rushing to certainties which themselves are on the way to becoming unassailable truths that both sides would believe in and will demonize the other, and that will present a real obstacle to any resumption of the peace process of any type within the spectrum that Shibli just described. So in many ways, I think we're at a turning point in relative terms. We're turning a page. Definitely we are turning a page, the page of that we could call the Barack Clinton page, which was the page of trying to reach a permanent status agreement. And I am convinced that at least for the next year or two, that item will no longer be on the agenda of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. But if we are turning a page, I think in terms of the U.S. responsibility, it's critical to understand what page is being turned and towards what page are we turning. And the page that's being turned, as I said, is a page that has now solidified into very contradictory images and impressions on both sides. And I believe it's in the U.S. responsibility, both members of the former administration and this one, to resist this tendency to demonize the other and to reach conclusions that are going to be impediments to resumption of the political process. And some of the moves right now that we hear of in the Congress in terms of taking finger-pointing and taking action against the Palestinians, I think go precisely in the direction of putting on obstacles to the kind of process that is needed for both sides, and I think both sides realize it. Sharon initiated contacts with the Palestinians even before he was elected, despite what he views as Arafat's present behavior, and Arafat reciprocated immediately despite what he views as Sharon's past behavior. So there's definitely a willingness to look beyond the biases and the prejudices of both sides and try to reach some accommodation. But I think it's important for the U.S. to play the public role of resisting the kind of demonization that we're seeing on both sides. And to reinforce the lesson that even though the process failed, it didn't fail because there were genetic flaws on either side, but because mistakes were made by all, Israelis, Palestinians, and Americans as the brokers of the process. As for the new page, I think there's an understandable reluctance right now on the part of the Bush administration to step back in the same way, in the same manner, the same intensity that the Clinton administration did. First, it's a matter of objective fact. As I said, there's no more permanent status agreement on the agenda for Israelis and Palestinians. And for the Bush administration to resume where the Clinton administration left off would make no sense from a purely political, objective fact at this time. There's also a subjective reality. I think the lessons that the Bush administration has learned from the Clinton administration is that over-involvement, from their perspective, it can be counterproductive in terms of the U.S. image in the Arab world and the U.S. image arguably in Israel. One could debate that point, but I think it's clearly the lesson that the Bush administration is taking from this, and so a certain distance from that perspective is understandable, and I think that we will see that. But there's a long way from taking your distance and being and turning a blind eye towards what's happening, and I think this is the second role in terms of the new page, not only redefining the old page, but looking at the new page. The administration has a role to step in and to try to bring the parties towards what I believe they want but are having a hard time getting to, and that is some form of arrangement now that would stabilize the situation, that would improve the lives of the Palestinians, that would resume security cooperation, that would bring stability and normalcy not only to the Israelis, but the Palestinians as well, who are suffering as they haven't suffered since Oslo and before, in terms of their living conditions and in terms of their economic conditions and in terms of the insecurity that they feel in their daily lives. And so there is, I believe, a convergence of interest right now, an objective one between Prime Minister Sharon and Chairman Arafat to try to find some kind of arrangement that would have some of these elements of lifting the economic siege, of alleviating the economic hardships that are now being imposed on the Palestinians, of restoring a sense of security, and having a territorial component that, as Prime Minister Sharon himself has indicated, would increase the territorial contiguity of the Palestinians, and that almost necessarily means more territorial withdrawals from Israel and more signs that the occupation is on its way to being ended. But how do you get there? Given the enormous distrust, given the hardened perceptions on both sides of what the other side has become and what it has always been, I think to get there, the U.S. administration is going to have to play a role. It may not have to be right away, and I think Shibli makes the point that right now, and it's a correct point, there has to be some testing of the waters, but that can't last for too long because the violence could get worse, the perceptions could get worse, and the reluctance and then the unwillingness of both sides to make any move will just become that much more impossible to overcome. So as we move towards what I think is a possible arrangement in the very short term, by which I mean it will not last too long because you're going to then have to move to the next phase, there are three questions that come to mind as to whether, or four questions that come to mind as to whether you can get there. The first question is on the Israeli side. Is the fact that Barak was prepared to concede roughly 95% of the West Bank and return it to the Palestinians, does that make it easier for the Israeli public to accept a redeployment now that would be much less, but that would give the Palestinians an immediate gain and a sense of greater territorial contiguity, fewer checkpoints, and lesser harassment? That would be one argument. Or, on the other hand, does the fact that they believe that Arafat was not prepared to make any of the final concessions on Jerusalem or refugees make it that much harder for the Israeli public to accept concessions that are, in their view, one-sided and that are not reciprocated by anything on the Palestinian side? That's one question that will determine whether these, what Sharon calls long-term interim arrangements, can occur. Second question is on the Palestinian side. Is the visible exhaustion with the violence, which I think there are many indicators of as we speak, is that going to lead the Palestinian public and therefore the Palestinian leadership to be more willing to try to strive for some accommodation that would meet some of the objectives I met earlier in terms of alleviating the suffering of the Palestinian people in the short term? Or, on the other hand, is the extreme human, emotional, and political toll and economic toll of the Intifada such that it will make it very hard for the Palestinian people and therefore the Palestinian leadership to accept anything short of what they could say was justified, justified by the sacrifices they made during the Intifada? So there's the second question in the equation. The third question is on the U.S. side. Will the lesson that the Bush administration learned ultimately from the Clinton administration and from the events of the last few months, that the Palestinian-Israeli issue remains at the heart of the Arab-Israeli conflict, that there can be no stability in the region until you redress the Palestinian question? Or, on the other hand, will the lesson be the one I mentioned earlier, that you better stay away from it because if you touch it, you burn your hands and there is no long-term solution anyway? And the answer to that question will also determine where we go. And finally, the last question I think that will determine the prospects for the future is whether the U.S., Israel, and the Palestinians will be able to overcome what I called earlier the rush to certainty, the eagerness to try to reach conclusions about the makeup, the genetic makeup, and the identity of the other side and what its true motivations and true aspirations are, or whether they'll be willing to come back to the more subtle and complex reality that both sides are imperfect and that both sides have to make hard concessions in order to reach the kind of peace that many in this room and many in Israel and among the Palestinians have been fighting for. The answer to those four questions, I think, will determine what will happen over the next year. Thank you.
I have a different task. In part, it's to to describe to you. It's actually a more difficult task because it's to describe to you Arab perceptions of this man who is now visiting Washington and visiting in his capacity as leader of Israel. It's not a pleasant job. It's not an easy job. Those of us who've lived through the last 5 decades or so of this conflict have very distinct feelings about Ariel Sharon and feelings about not only who he is, what he represents, and the patterns of behavior that he has manifested. I need to do this before I get into talking about where we go, because perceptions that each side have of each other, as Rob notes, are critical. And before I'm accused by some of incitement, Ariel Sharon himself on November 14th, just a few months ago, said Yasser Arafat's a murderer and a liar. He's a bitter enemy. 2 members of his own cabinet, one actually referred recently to Arabs as not having the souls of human beings, but instead being poisonous snakes and worthy of treatment befitting a poisonous snake. So there's problems here. But when we talk about Sharon, it's not a question of name calling. It's a question of history and remembering. Someone commented the other day, Arabs should give him a chance. He may end up being Nixon going to China. My response was, Arabs will give him a chance. They'll have no choice but to do so. But we already had Nixon going to China, and that was Rabin. This is not quite the same thing. This is more like Saddam going to Kuwait or Milosevic going to Sarajevo. The Arab memories of Sharon are 1982. It's the march to Beirut and the devastation that was wreaked on the way. I lived every day through that conflict. And every day, especially as Beirut was not only surrounded and bombarded, but entered and ravaged. People remember Sabra and Shatila, but there were massacres before that massacre, and there were massacres after that massacre. The legacy is a difficult one. It goes back to the 50s. He headed a unit called 101 that participated in what were called cross-border retaliatory raids, but resulted in the massacre of many innocent people. In the 70s, he headed the cleansing operation. It was called, a nice word, I guess, the cleansing operation in Gaza that resulted in the demolitions of homes and the expulsions of thousands and the destruction of life. In the late 70s is probably when Sharon made his most lasting contribution to this conflict, and that was the settlement expansion program that he headed. I had to go and look in my files, as when I was introduced, it was noted that I headed the Palestine Human Rights Campaign in the late 70s, and so I went rummaging through my papers, and I found maps from the Israeli press in the 70s that I've saved, in part because I had a feeling at the time that they were being discussed, that history was being made. I actually point to the fact that Barak beat himself in this election, but Sharon laid the predicate for the defeat in 1978 and 79. Actually, what Sharon did in those years was he implemented a settlement program that had been designed by a group, the World Zionist Organization. It was called the Drobels Plan, and it was interesting because of what it was and what its intention was. This was the time, if you recall, that the United States was declaring settlements an obstacle to peace and illegal. Illegal because it was a contravention of international law, but an obstacle to peace because of what the intention of the Drobels Plan and therefore the Likud settlement plan was. It was to move settlements from what they had traditionally been, which were outposts along the Jordan Valley and the Green Line, and move them into the heart of the West Bank and Gaza. And to do so, and to connect them by roads with Israel proper, so that in the words of the plan, the Arab area would be cut into several grids so that contiguity of land would be impossible. Actually, to atomize the Arab area was the word that was used. And actually, that's what happened. If you go to the West Bank today, it's not a question of 95% or 90% or whether you include the Jerusalem belt or not, but it's where the 95% is, and actually where the other 5% is. It's like this. Take, for example, Virginia annexing Washington, D.C., and deciding that as a security perimeter, they needed the Beltway, but also deciding that as a security precaution, they needed some outposts, and so Columbia, Maryland was going to be part of it, and Route 95 going north also had to be a part of it. And Annapolis was an important historical and cultural site, and so it also had to be included, and Route 50 was part of it as well. And so what you have then is a situation comparable to what we're talking about. It's really not a big part of Maryland that we're taking. It's really a small part of Maryland, but it's part of Maryland that, number one, severs Maryland from its urban hub, which was where many people in Maryland work, the D.C. proper area, and they have to go through a beltway with checkpoints to get into it. But it also takes two sites that, with a band going out, a security road, and severs people being able to go from place to place through those two belts. And that is essentially what the settlement blocks in the West Bank amount to, the settlement blocks that Sharon built and that Israel wants to keep as part of its 5 or 6%, which is why Sharon created the predicate for this problem in '78. It was to make it impossible. Yes, you'll get 90-something% back, but the percent you get back will be severed piece from piece because you can't go from one to the other easily. You have to go around settlements, which are basically around huge hills and cumbersome roads, through checkpoints. What would be ordinarily a 20-minute trip now becomes a 3-hour trip. And it was done with a design. The design was to make the landmass of the West Bank impossible to be restored, to be returned to Palestinians. And so actually, when the U.S. declared them an obstacle to peace, they weren't kidding. It was. And it remains an obstacle to peace. Of course, we go beyond that to 1982, where by misleading his own government and embarking on an invasion of Lebanon that led to Beirut, Sharon made himself a legend in the Arab mind. I did a book. I remember in 1982, I called it The Bitter Year. It was a catalog of both Israel's work in Lebanon, but also of the treatment of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, which was ignored during that period. There was also a period of unrest as well. There were cross-border raids. There was a problem. Palestinians had actually stopped most of the violence. There was this attempted assassination in London of an Israeli diplomat that turned out to not be a person involved with the PLO, but actually the person who was involved in that assassination attempt was a sworn enemy of the PLO. But nevertheless, launching on that, Sharon began both an effort to squash Palestinians in the West Bank and also actually described by the chief of staff at the time, General Raphael Etian. He said, the physical annihilation of the PLO has got to be achieved. That is, not only must its fingers and hands in the West Bank be amputated, as is now being done with an iron fist, but its heart and head in Beirut must be smashed. And that was the purpose of the invasion of Lebanon, and it was the purpose of the iron fist. And much of what people fear today happening on the West Bank saw its predicate in what happened in 1982. Villages being closed off one from another, water and gas and food, essential supplies being prohibited, collective punishment on a massive scale, and an effort to beat a people into submission. It, of course, didn't work. And the period from '82 to the present has been a long and tedious one, rebuilding both the question of trust between the two peoples, in the sense of confidence that peace was possible. In the 1990s, Sharon was involved again in further settlement expansion. After '82, it should be recalled that the Kahan Commission in Israel, evaluating what happened in Lebanon, especially in the massacres in Sabra and Shatila, made the recommendation that Sharon never again allowed to be defense minister. And so in other capacities, he was involved in government and specifically chose for himself areas that would place him involved in settlement activity. In '98, when an interesting note, when Netanyahu was withdrawing from areas of the West Bank as part of an agreement that he had signed with the Palestinians, it was Sharon who advised settlers to seize the hilltops, and they did. And then in 2000, it was Ariel Sharon who, in an effort to protect his right flank against Benjamin Netanyahu, who he saw as potentially threatening his desire to become the prime minister, entered the Haram Sharif accompanied by hundreds of Israeli military and set off the provocation that resulted in the violence that we are seeing today. My point to you is that it's a difficult man and a difficult history. And as I said, Arabs will give him a chance. They will have no choice but to give him a chance. He was elected, but it is not an easy history to forget, and it is one where people will be very watchful. A couple of final observations. What does the U.S. do at this point? We've heard suggestions from Shibli and from Rob, and I think most of them are ones that I would agree with. I would say to you, though, that that the difficulty I see at present is that we have a balancing act of interests, and the administration has noted that we actually have conflicts we're facing at both ends of the Middle East, from our relationship with Iraq to our historical relationship with this search for peace. And the two are intimately bound up one with another. There is no direct linkage, America insists. But certainly if we don't have capital earned in one, we don't have the capital to invest in attempting to solve the other. It was the Gulf War that gave America the impetus and the regional leadership to move forward to Madrid. The unraveling of the peace process and the collapse of sanctions don't make a pretty picture. My point is that if the administration is concerned with Gulf security issues, it really doesn't compute that they turn around and ignore the Arab-Israeli conflict, or at least give it time and play a watch and wait game. The fact is that there's no earned capital at this point. America is in conceivably its most difficult regional situation that it's been in a long time, and that's happened actually in a short period of time that all of this has unraveled. I think that the problem here is that there are some very deep feelings in the Arab world today about the U.S., not only with regard to having lost this propaganda battle over the sanctions with Iraq and who was responsible for the suffering of the Iraqi people, but also having allowed the situation with regard to the Israeli actions against the Palestinians to be identified or defined as U.S.-supported actions. Throughout the presidential campaign, both campaigns would put the blame squarely on Chairman Arafat. Even today, the effort to say first the violence must end and then, as if the Palestinians are the only party to this conflict who must act now. There have been some signs from Secretary Powell, some gestures about what Israel should or should not do regarding no new provocations, no unilateral actions, freeing up monies that have been extorted from Palestinians, tax monies that are the Palestinians due and are not negotiable items. But more, I think, must be done. More signals should be sent. I believe that this process unraveled because Palestinians lost hope. I believe that they lost hope because 7 years after peace, they had waded through a very difficult period when settlement size practically doubled, when land confiscation to pave new roads had added to their burdens in the West Bank. They had become poorer, less employed, less free to move about, and less hopeful. When they came to Camp David and the deal that was offered was a stretch for the Israelis, but not what Palestinians had endured 7 years of hardship to get, I think that the explosion was almost decreed. It was almost a logical response that Palestinians would, in fact, erupt and be out of control. The dream had been deferred, to paraphrase Langston Hughes, for way too long. And with the frustration came this response. I think the problem the U.S. has today is that it's been identified to too great a degree with the Israeli response, specifically the use of weapons. We have an Arms Export Control Act. Israel is using advanced U.S. military weapons in pursuit of policies that we have judged not in the interest of peace, or in some cases more than that. The use of helicopter gunships to assassinate leaders, we've condemned that. We've condemned it, but we haven't taken action on the issue. And the use continues. And I believe that the U.S. needs to earn some capital. And the way to earn some capital is to at least be firm on the weapons use issue, to be more firm on the money issue, to be more vigorous on the settlement issue. No unilateral actions has become such a mush. I mean, if I use that language bringing up my kids, they'd be spoiled as hell today. There are times you need to be firm and decisive. We've been firm and decisive with Palestinians. We have not been as firm and decisive with Israel. It is bizarre. It is bizarre that since the initial trade-off was made leading up to Madrid on settlements and the Arabs suspending the secondary boycott is ended, but settlements have doubled. And that the U.S. has had nothing more to contribute to that discussion than no unilateral actions, or they're unhelpful, doesn't make sense, and doesn't establish the credibility that we need, the credit that we need to pursue our regional interests. I do not believe that we're in this process merely as a matter of being a good party to the world, or because we have a moral stake in the pursuit of anything. We're in this because we have dramatic interests in the Middle East. And we've acknowledged that all along. It got crude at one point during the Gulf War. It was oil, 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 said our Secretary of State. But the fact is that we have interests. We've long sought to protect those interests. Those interests are at risk. And it's not just oil, but it's also the stability and friendship of our alliances in the region. And it is also our ability to operate in that region. Part of it is the conflict in the Gulf and Gulf security. Part of it is that threatens it is the Arab-Israeli conflict. But we cannot sit by passively as our interests are at risk and our credibility is eroded, and not recognize the danger. And so I suggest that that actions should be taken, even if not in the pursuit of a negotiated settlement, actions at least to send messages to Israel about what is acceptable and what is not, and messages that are public, because I've been assured by the State Department that yes, Israel knows, and we've communicated very privately to them that the helicopter gunship should not be used. That doesn't earn you any credit. It doesn't earn you credit when your credit is maybe at the lowest level that it's been. And so I think that there are things that we can do, and we've offered suggestions about what we can do, and our hope is that the administration will respond in this crisis to take a firmer stand against Israeli practices, at least in an effort, on the one hand, to restrain Sharon from actions that may duplicate what he has done in the past, I don't know, and also to give needed hope to Palestinians so that, in fact, they'll have incentive to end the current situation and think of a better future, because I don't think that they see that in the cards right now. And I'll end there, and we'll take some questions. Thank you. Yes.
You had a meeting at State Department yesterday. I'm wondering if you could summarize what happened, or last week, excuse me.
The meeting with Secretary Powell was of 20 plus Arab American leaders from 15 organizations around the country. It was an effort on his part to reach out and talk about his most recent trip to the region and to hear from us. I was very impressed by the fact that he opened the meeting acknowledging the mistake he had made, that he had misspoken on the question of Jerusalem. The rest of the meeting focused on some issues of concern to us, specifically the question of Jerusalem and the issue of the U.S. Embassy. We are assured that no movement is taking place on that. We discussed as well the questions of the deteriorating human rights and economic situation of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And we talked about a couple of issues that I've mentioned today. One, specifically the use of U.S. weapons that the State Department assures us is under study, and that actions will be taken. The other issue we raised is the question of the treatment of Americans of Arab descent traveling to and through Israel. The situation has been difficult for more than 20 years. It's become increasingly difficult since the peace process started and more Palestinian Americans in particular traveled. It is unconscionable to us that American citizens travel to Israel and are told by their own State Department in the travel advisory, if you are an American citizen born in the West Bank, expect to be treated as an Arab, not as an American. Passports are taken and people are told that they must get a Palestinian ID in order to leave. Their passport is not even recognized by the Israeli government. Unacceptable. Unacceptable. We made that clear. And we also, of course, discussed the matter of Iraq and the sanctions against Iraq. And frankly, I think that there was more of a meeting of mind on several of these questions than we would have expected. Going in, the question is, the policy reformulation is not done. We don't know what the administration will be doing. We don't know to what extent Secretary Powell and his views will be the determining factors in the shaping of a new policy, but the fact is the meeting was a good one.
You obviously did not read what Paul had to say yesterday to AIPAC, I guess. Did you?
I read, yes.
I mean, he repeats the same cliches that all the other administrations have said. Why do they keep doing that?
Well, basically what you get is we have interests, but there also is domestic politics, and you got to read out of the domestic politics there.
So are you hopeful that they can do something more than that?
I'm not especially hopeful. I think I'd take the Shibley perspective. I'm not an optimist or a pessimist. I'm a realist. I know I kind of fully expected that. It was probably less bad than it might have been. But we're used to reading speeches that way. If there are less wince lines than you would ordinarily get, you feel good. With regard to what they'll do, I think that what we're proposing to them to do, if weighed in the balance, I think that they ought to find a way to distance themselves from what Israel is currently doing, and they are not distanced enough. Even the suggestion by Sharon's government that they need an additional $479 million US dollars to compensate them for the costs of, well, that includes the Lebanon. The 479, though, specifically was the number used to describe how much they need to compensate for what they've spent on the West Bank. Unacceptable. Unacceptable. And it wouldn't send the right message at all.
May I just follow up on this? I always believed throughout the campaign that the expectations in the Arab world are unrealistic about how a Republican administration would be so dramatically different from a Democratic administration. I think it was a wishful thinking. I think every administration faces very similar set of constraints both at home and abroad, and I think those are the ones that dominate ultimately. And it isn't just Congress. I think Congress certainly is a factor in constraining the policy. But frankly, even within the Republican establishment and the administration itself, the view of the Palestinian Authority is not very positive, even if they're more sympathetic with the situation on the ground for the Palestinians, even when they may be frustrated with the Israeli government's behavior. There is almost a culture of disdain, if one might call it that, for the authority, for historical reasons. That you find it even more in the Republican Congress than you do in the Democratic Congress. And one can argue actually that in some ways, because the previous administration had been working with the authority and the Palestinians for so many years, actually there was an increased empathy that developed, not because they're Democrats, but because they were the administration. And so I think I don't expect a dramatic change in U.S. policy toward the Arab-Israeli issue. I think the same facts impose themselves. And frankly, when you look at the sort of hands-off policy now that the administration has taken for a while, at least, to test the waters, people forget that when Clinton was elected back in 1993, he took a similar policy. He just wasn't going to be active. He certainly continued the Madrid process, but ultimately it was the Palestinians who decided the Americans aren't going to do anything that explored the secret diplomacy that led to Oslo. So the administration became involved actively after a major breakthrough, which happened without the administration's own intervention. We may be witnessing something similar at the moment. It's not a Republican-Democratic attitude. But I also want to say something about what Jim had said about the Arab perception of Sharon. That, of course, is absolutely right, and it's very hard to overcome the history and the emotions. But I also want to warn against sort of leaping into the conclusion, and therefore it's impossible to do business with the guy. I mean, remember, we used to hear that on the Israeli side. You could never negotiate with the PLO. They don't represent the Palestinian people because they were seen to be a terrorist organization. And everybody was saying, look, they represent the Palestinian people, and you got to make a deal with them no matter how you see them. Well, Sharon is the elected Prime Minister of Israel despite all of the baggage that he comes with. Now, it may be true that you can't do business with him, but not necessarily because of his past. I mean, if he were to go ahead and be willing to sign an agreement, the likes of which the Palestinians want, then I think the Palestinians are very willing to put aside the past. I mean, the issue is not just the past. The past is hard to overcome. It's always going to be there. It's very painful. But ultimately, the judgment about him is going to depend on how he behaves. And actually, I think to their credit, Arab leaders are saying exactly that. They're saying, as Prime Minister, they're going to judge him on the basis of what he does now, rather than on the basis of what he did in the past. It's hard to do. It's very hard to do, especially when there is so much pain. But it has to be done.
I can't disagree with you on the fact that they will do business because they have to do business, and in fact, they will be watchful and wary as they do business. I just think it's important, though, that too much of the discussion, the political discourse, is informed by one side to this. Israel makes the painful concessions. Israel has to deal with the person with the past. Israel has to, as if there is no difficulty, as if Arafat, in putting his hand out to Rabin, was somehow not just an easy thing to do, but was a reaching out and a longing to touch the hand of the other. It's painful on both sides. Rabin and shaking hands with Rabin, and for Arafat to sit down with Barak, who had personally led the assassination attempt of, and the assassination of some of Arafat's personal and closest colleagues who had founded the organization with him. We talk about today the difficulty of the Palestinians not having a leadership succession. Most of them were assassinated. And and Barack or Sharon were in charge of that effort. It is painful on both sides. And so I'm not saying that they won't do business. I just think it's important in the context of a discussion in America to understand it's difficult for everybody. And this guy is especially difficult. Yes, they'll do business, and yes, they will deal with him. They have to. He was elected by the government of Israel, but it isn't easy. And you ought to know it's not easy, and put it in context.
Next week, the Arab Summit Conference is taking place in Amman. What do you think should the Arabs do, or what decisions can they take to impress on this administration to drop all these cliches and be really even-handed, if that's the right word still? Maybe Mr. Mali can help in an answer, since he was very close to the seat of power here.
Well, I mean, I really would agree with what Shibli said. I think this notion of a 180-degree turn by the administration is one that I think is an illusion. Anyone who believed it was building a strategy based on an illusion. Anyone who believes it now is following the same path. So I don't think you're going to see changes on the part of the administration that are of the type that some people would hope for in terms of abandoning cliches and stereotypes. The things about cliches and stereotypes is they stick for a reason, and they're there because they're an accumulated political, historical, and strategic body of interests of the United States. It doesn't mean that there are not ways to move the administration, and I think at some points the Clinton administration moved, and I think the Bush administration will move if there's a strong sense from the Arab countries of how to deal with the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, in a constructive way, if they offer a way that they believe is not, let's go back to Taba, let's go back to Camp David. They wouldn't say that, but let's go back to Taba. But something that would be constructive, in which they don't take the view that Sharon is somebody you can't do business with, but they offer what they consider realistic, even though it would be tough for the American administration to accept, a realistic path forward. I think to try to shift an administration's view completely, which is really, it was not particular to Clinton, it was not particular to his predecessors, and it won't be particular to his successors. There's a basic course of U.S. diplomacy and strategy in the Middle East, and it's within those constraints that one has to operate.
Yes.
To what extent are our dictator friends in the Middle East, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, concerned about domestic unrest being sparked by the whole Palestinian issue?
I think that there are several measures of Arab public opinion today that ought to be a cause of concern to this administration, and they are number one, the fact that there were mass demonstrations in Arab capitals that had, in some instances, not seen demonstrations before. There is a fiery debate that takes place on a daily basis now in every Arab capital. I host a call-in talk show. Mine's in English. The debate is hot, but it's hotter on several of the other networks. And there is no Arab capital today that is immune from this debate. Feelings are high, and the ability to form a public opinion, to shape that opinion, is greater now than it ever was in the past. There was a time when Arab society had limited amounts of information available to them. CNN changed all that. The presence of a dozen or so Arab satellite cable networks that broadcast 24 hours a day and frequently involve audience participation programs and feature direct footage from hotspots like the daily conflicts that are brewing in the West Bank and Gaza do in fact create a following. And so, yeah, I think that there is enormous reason for concern. One of the reasons I think that regarding the Arab Summit, there was or was rumored to be a U.S. effort to have the summit take a different course. We are beyond that now. the rumors fly hot and heavy. If Arab leaders go to that summit and don't come out with statements that are directly in support of the Palestinians and what they're dealing with, if they attempt to take positions that mimic positions coming from Washington, I think that there will be trouble. And we have to respect that to the same extent that we ask Arab leaders to understand our public opinion and the need that we have to balance our domestic politics and our foreign policy. We have to respect that Arab leaders are dealing with the same things in their own societies. The process may be different, but the reality of public opinion and the reality that public opinion both there and here help shape how we move on issues is a fact of life in the modern era, and it's something we have to deal with.
May I just add a little bit to that, because I think that no question that the events of the past several months have shown once again that Arab public opinion matters even in authoritarian societies. And there's no question that the new media has played a very important role in broadening the Palestinian-Israeli conflict into an Arab-Israeli conflict that led to demonstrations the likes of which we have not seen in a long time. And there's no question that many Arab governments are concerned about that, at the same time that they feel constrained by what happened. But I also want to say that we ought not exaggerate a bit too much. There's a very different, it's a very different thing to say there is public concern in the region and there are demonstrations, and another thing to say those could translate into revolution or major change. Governments in the region have proven to be robust. They've become much more robust over time, not less robust over time, despite very clear public sentiment. And frankly, demonstrations in 1 day or 2 or 3 don't add up into organized opposition that would directly threaten governments. It only limits what a government can do on foreign policy. It certainly means that governments have to expend more resources to it, which again limits their possibilities. But I do not interpret that to be sort of a one has to think about what the expectations were back in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and people were saying that there were going to be major revolutions. They didn't materialize, even though there is definitely strong public sentiment in various parts along the line. That's because governments are more robust for whatever historical reasons than people want to give them credit. For good or for bad. I'm not making a moral judgment about it. I'm just saying that is the reality. And I think they are concerned. The Palestinians certainly hope that the lesson for them would be to help more. And they are, obviously, the commitment by the Arab Summit last time to contribute $1 billion to the Palestinian cause was in part a function of those events. Well, much of that money has not been transferred, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in this Arab Summit conference, whether any of it would really translate into some consequential action.
Let me I agree with you completely, and precisely for that reason, I think you will see that the public opinion that is shaped by this, by public outrage to what is going on, creates the constraint that produces situations that we still have to be wary of. Not the overthrow of a government, but an Arab summit can't be transformed by America's interest. It will rather operate according to its own interest. Arab leaders will not immediately defer. I mean, we may lose an arms sale here or there. We may lose the ability to transform how Arab countries deal with oil prices. People are operating more in their own interest because they've been forced to by public opinion than they have to simply play along with and adapt themselves to our interests. And I think that's been the big constraint. And the extent to which there's a gap between our interests and their interests, to that extent the situation becomes more precarious for us to operate in the region. Not for them. They will save themselves, as they ought to save themselves first. And that will mean distancing themselves more and more from what we would like them to do in partnership with us. Yeah, George.
Yeah. Can we talk about money? I'm a taxpayer, you're a taxpayer.
Yep.
And to me, Israeli defiance is backed by mostly the money and where it comes from and the influence on Capitol Hill and to on elected officials. My recollection is that in the old days, the only president who had the political and moral guts, if you please, was Eisenhower, who said, "You get out of Suez or else. You won't see, we'll draw the purse strings and you won't see a penny." Nobody since has had the political courage. Now, I realize that this is the way it is here. My question is, with the new impetus in Congress about soft money and things like this, can you make a connection between this and whether or not the influence of money in the United States for elected office would in a way affect the influence here on the elective selection?
We did all this research back in the late 80s and early 90s and I published a number of little books on the question. And of course there is no question, and there shouldn't be a question about the connection. And I remember when I was attacked for making the connection, I said, how bizarre to attack me. I mean, if banking interests can shape policy and we acknowledge that, if doctors can shape policy and we acknowledge that, if the insurance companies can shape policy and we acknowledge that, then why can't we acknowledge that money given for an issue cause, and we know that the pro-Israel forces give significant amounts of money to shape the debate on that, also has an impact. Somehow that issue's been immune from both recognition and criticism. But the fact is that it's there. It's an issue that we have to deal with. Our response to it has been to sometimes work around it, and sometimes attempt to mimic it by saving people that we want to save in office and helping others get elected, and recognizing as well that it's not a monolith. It's not a monolith at all. There is today, I think, one of the most interesting things about the pro-Israel side of this debate is that there have in fact become two distinct forms of being pro-Israel. Part of it was the result of the peace process. There is a significant body of opinion in the American Jewish community for whom the definition of pro-Israel means supporting a just peace with Palestinians. And they also contribute money to politicians. The issues become a little murkier. I mean, do you account for some of the bizarre letters that are circulating around the Hill right now, that by anything other than the influence of a skewed debate on this issue? The answer is yeah, of course. I mean, some of the legislation that's being proposed, punitive against Palestinians or rewarding Israel for things that they don't need to be rewarded for, or heralding the liberator Sharon, some of those things are plain and simple silly, ought not to happen, don't send the right message, but actually are viewed with the same eye roll by other members of Congress and most of American public opinion as we greet them as well. But there is within the pro-Israel debate today a very, I think, a very interesting set of lines being drawn. And there are people who are very supportive of peace, and there are those who are not. And I think that this will work its way out in the next couple of years, and we need to continue to build alliances with those who in their definition of being pro-Israel are also pro-peace and supportive of a solution that serves the interests of both Israel, the Palestinians on the one side, and the United States on the other.
Can I just say something about, just as a clarification, you mentioned Eisenhower. Obviously the United States is not a dictatorship, it's a democracy. I mean, you're not going to have a president who's going to assert himself or herself against the public sentiment. The political system, in a democracy, you respond to political pressure. It's a good thing, not a bad thing, in the American democracy to be responsive. You don't want a too centralized a government that disregards the wishes of the people. Now, how do you determine the wishes of the people? Well, this American political system is really focused on responding to the segments of the public that care most deeply about issues. And sure, money matters, voting matters, political pressure matters. It ought to. It should. If you're a human rights organization, that's the way you want to do it, to employ it. And so what American Jewish organizations do is exactly what they should do, what Arab American organizations should do, what Greek American organizations should do for their own interest, or what the physicians or the agricultural lobby or whatever do every day of the week. I mean, sure, you can talk about the reform of the system overall, but I think the blame should not be placed. There's nothing unusual about that anyway. I think, people who want to have a say in the system, that's the way you have a say in the system. Arab Americans have not been as active in the political process, and they ought to. If they care passionately about issues, they ought to let politicians know about it. But that's their right. It's also the Jewish American right. And so it's not something that is unusual or even unhealthy, I would say. I mean, the fact is that that's the way the American democracy is defined.
I think the only time it becomes unhealthy is when it's not contested. And that is what we've had to learn as a community, is that if the game was being played by one side and we weren't playing, the debate was going to be skewed. Part of the reason for the asymmetry of power that exists in domestic politics is that one side played and the other side didn't. And I think Shibley's absolutely right there. Back here, yeah?
Just two questions. The first is for Mr. O'Malley. What advice would you give the U.S. Congress to take steps not to handicap the administration's efforts to advance the political process in the way that they did sort of last term? And the second question is, I guess for Mr. Zogby and Mr. Tahami, it's to what extent do you think it's actually a negative for the Palestinians to engage with a negative for them not in their interests to engage with Mr. Sharon, in that Mr. Sharon yesterday mentioned as two of his sort of top priorities are bringing a Zionist education to all Jewish children and to sort of increasing immigration throughout Israel in a speech to AIPAC. To what extent do you think sort of engaging him and sort of being on the same moral plateau as he, and both sort of adopting the discourse of peace in some way, rather than sort of related, of course, to the American political issue, to what extent do you think that harms us politically in this country?
I think the basic principles should be do no harm. I don't know that one could expect helpful legislation, but I think it's been true throughout administrations that the Congress, for reasons, again, that Shibley and Jim have spoken about, have taken positions that have been more prone to finger point at the Palestinians and take action against them. It's focused usually on the issue of Jerusalem, which every administration has had to stave off, and I assume it will be the same in this administration. And now, as it has in the past, it's also taking the form of legislation that might curtail assistance to the Palestinians, which at this point, given the conditions in the territory and given the anxiety in the administration about what the future of the authority is precisely the opposite of what ought to be done, and of other things such as trying to bar contact with certain members of the PLO and perhaps redesignating certain of their organizations as terrorist organizations. I think these are the kind of things that right now, and you could always say every situation is sensitive, but right now to engage in this kind of diplomacy from the Hill could have very serious consequences if it were imposed on the administration. And as I said, there's strong sentiment in the U.S. right now that is not particularly sympathetic to the Palestinians. And by the U.S., I mean administration and other corridors of power. And one has to acknowledge that. It's a fact, and it's a byproduct of what happened over the last 6 months. But to take the step of legislating in a way that would hamper and handcuff the administration, what it is trying to do, and send at a time where emotions are so high among Palestinians and in the Arab world, the message that the U.S. has definitely taken sides, and at a time when their suffering is going to reward the person who, in their view, is inflicting the suffering, would be precisely the wrong way to go. And I believe that the administration, which probably has a better relationship with this Congress than the Clinton one did, will find some way to stall and to make sure that kind of legislation doesn't see the light of day, or that if it does, it is with such wiggle room and such waiver authority that it doesn't constrain the administration in any significant way.
Israel's elected a prime minister. The reasons that he was elected, I think we can debate that. He is the elected official that represents that country. And I think the Palestinians at present, the speech that Arafat gave to his people was right on message. He laid out his position. He indicated a willingness to negotiate on certain grounds, and that's about what he could do right now. I don't think that the message, "I will not talk to you because of who you are and what your past has been," would work. I don't think it would be appropriate. It certainly wouldn't be well received in Israel. I don't think it would be well received here. And I think his own people understand that you talk to people you have a difficult past with, but you lay out what your positions are and you're clear about them. And I think he's done about what he could do right now.
Well, you know, the historical process of reconciliation, the whole negotiation, the Oslo Accords, the likely negotiations of the future, are really all predicated on a solution in the end which will have a Palestinian state representing Palestinian nationalism next to Israel as a Jewish state. That is where it's headed to the extent that it's possible, and that has been the basis of the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. And Israel clearly, in the context of a final settlement where there is a Palestinian state and justice for Palestinians, Israel will remain a Jewish state, and Israel will have every right to ask for anybody, any Jews, to come into Israel as a Jewish state. So I don't see that as being in conflict with the Palestinian interest. I think in the short term, the reason the Palestinians are frustrated on the ground is because you don't have a Palestinian state, you don't have a settlement of the refugee issue, and it seems that the game is zero-sum. So the demands for land and so forth are going to be more fulfilled in the direction of one side or the other. But in general, in principle, there's nothing wrong with the state identifying itself as it does in Zionist terms. And in asking for immigrants to come to Israel. The problem, as I suggested, is really in this environment when there is no Palestinian state and there is no settlement of the refugee problem.
And that's related to also something I want to ask Rob Mali about, because President Clinton himself also asserted that the return or the right of return for the Palestinian would threaten the character of the Jewish state, Israel as a Jewish state. And I wonder, isn't that or wasn't that what the U.S. fought against Milosevic in Kosovo, that you cannot engineer an ethnically or dominant ethnic, any ethnic majority in one place? You cannot say that the U.S. has the right to remain as a white state or majority white state or European state or Christian state. So to say that about Israel, I really wonder how could you justify that in secular terms?
Let me just say that given the time, that will be the last question, and Rob, and then Shibli, and then we'll close. Thank you.
I mean, I think the whole logic of the settlement, as Shibli said, whether one agrees with it or not, and there's some people who advocate a binational state, and that's a solution that has, on moral grounds, a lot of appeal. But the logic of the solution that Palestinians and Israelis, in their representative bodies, and the U.S., has adopted is two states. One would be a Jewish state, the other one would be a Palestinian state. Again, one can disagree with it, but once you make that your recipe for a solution, then the notion, what the president said, what President Clinton said, is there cannot be a right of return that would threaten the Jewish character of the Jewish state. And in fact, the Palestinians didn't quibble with that. I've never heard a Palestinian in the negotiations say that they thought that was a line that went too far. They agreed that they would have to manage it in a way that wouldn't threaten the Jewish character of the Israeli state. Again, there are many people who might find morally and ethically that that's not a solution that appeals to them. But it is a solution the parties have chosen. It's the solution that the president was trying to pursue. Two states. One would be the homeland of the Palestinians. The other be the homeland of Jews and others who currently reside there, but would not be the homeland also of the Palestinian refugees. That's the logic towards which Oslo and the acceptance of two states, that's the logic towards which those concessions and those compromises on both sides would head us towards if we ever get there. I think there's a logic to it, and it does impose concessions to some deeply held beliefs by many people about the fact that we don't want to create states that are based on a certain ethnic group, a certain religion. But that's the reality that people have accepted, and if we're going to find a solution on those bases, I think there's no escaping it. Again, others want to revisit it, and that's their right.
Yeah, I think you're confusing two issues, really. One issue is, the universal moral principle, which anybody could stick to, which is that you don't accept ethno-nationalism and you just call for a binational state, which is somebody that, I think it's a position that is morally defendable, and there are people who take that position. Clearly, that would not lend itself, that's a zero-sum game between Israel as it defines itself now and Palestinian national movement as it defines itself now, and you wouldn't have a negotiation. If you look at the entire history of the negotiation, or in fact UN resolutions based on the partition plan, the idea of 1947, the partition plan, was to have a Jewish state and an Arab state in Palestine. That was the idea, that you have those two national movements as a reality. All the negotiations have been based on the idea of framing the conflict as a nationalist conflict, not an ethnic conflict, but a nationalist conflict. And therefore, to satisfy the nationalist aspiration of the Palestinian people and nationalist aspiration of the Jewish people in two states. That's the logic of the negotiations. And if they are to commence and if they are to end, it has to be along these lines. Now, it's possible that people will reject it. Well, that's up to the Palestinians and Israelis to reject it. We wouldn't have the same kind of negotiations. We would be starting from square one. I don't know what that would lead to. I personally think that it would probably mean waiting for another generation or more for a possible settlement. If the Palestinians and Israelis want that, it's their choice. I don't find that as particularly a happy outcome.
Let me just say that I think that there's some interesting writers on the Israeli left and liberal side, liberal left, not far left, who are today posing just the 25-year down the road scenario and saying that we will be talking about one state with equal rights for both people if we wait another generation. The fact is that when the Palestinians made the historic compromise that has never been viewed correctly here in America as a historic compromise, to give up the notion of a secular democratic state and opt for an acceptance of a partition, it was an enormous compromise on their part, and in the process of doing so, they needed a partner. They have not yet found a partner. Israel is willing to offer some land as a concession, but the notion of two independent, sovereign entities, each in control of their own access and egress, each in control of their own internal and external affairs, is not something that has yet been accepted. And so what some Israeli writers are positing is something similar to what Edward Said is positing, and that is that let's wait 25 years and wait for the Mandela of this region to appear, who says we won't accept a Bantustan. We need to have equal rights, and you'll have by then, 25 years from now, you'll have a majority Palestinian population within the historic land of Israel, Palestine. If that's an option that people want to wait 25 years, it's there. But the fact is that there is a compromise available today, and it has not been accepted, I think, in the way that it needs to be accepted in order to be implemented. We're going to close, and I thank you very much for participating, all of you today. Thank you to Rob, and thank you to Shibli especially. Is that a Sadat Peace Center pen? Is that a Sadat pen?
How are you?
It's the cheap, whatever it is. Does it say Sadat Center? Come on. Hey.
Much more fair than the one.
Yeah.
Already?
This one.
Which one was that?
Continuation of yesterday.